And then we're at 12:03. So I guess I'm gonna, okay, yeah, cool. We're gonna keep this conversation hopefully going for the Q&A section. Hopefully, I'm gonna keep admitting folks here as well, but we've got a lot to cover here. If like a lot of these go, we might go a little bit long. And if that's the case, well, and in any case, we're going to give you the recording afterward. Everybody that attends, I've got everyone's emails from the registration on Zoom. And so you'll get the full version of whatever that we end up having here, because sometimes the Q&A goes a little bit over an hour and it's not mandatory at that point to attend. So, and then on top of that, there's a lot of trees. There's a lot of trees that don't get talked about. And this is only part one, as you can see here. Yvette and I have been working on a lot of the native trees for South Florida that you might not commonly see, and probably are in many regards like underutilized species. And so I guess that's a good point to start going along here. So I guess, Yvette, could you go next slide, please? Okay, yeah. So, and then, yeah, geography and climate matter. Traditionally, for a lot of what we see in Florida, we tend to think over rely historically on the temperate type species, because we are occasional subject to cold weather that can really hurt the species at the extreme southern part of the state. However, we are you can see this dashed line right here at 30 degrees, and it is we're very close to the tropics. And you could see that actually, like, according to the continental sides of things here, that we're on the eastern side of of a big continental mass. So we're very similar, actually, compared to Southeast Asia, a southern part of Africa on the eastern side, this eastern Australia, and on the eastern part of South America. So a lot of Brazil. And this is where we would potentially have a lot of plants that do well, and those environments would potentially do well here. For here, a lot of things that do well in South Florida are throughout the entire Caribbean basin and parts of Central America. And you're going to see a common trend here when we start going over the ranges for a lot of these species. We tend to think of them more as like key species. But however, I guess their ranges are kind of moving north with the USDA hardiness zones that have just been updated as well. So next slide, please. So you can see here, the USDA hardiness zones were updated in 2023. On the left-hand side, we had what we were using from about 2010 until 2023. And it took into account your coldest nights, basically, your coldest temperatures. And some of that really influential data has dropped out. We had some outliers for really cold nights in the 80s that impacted us in Florida. And now that data has not become part of the range, you can see here originally it was 1976 to 2005. Now it's 1999, 91 to 2020. That all the way in Orlando is part of 10A. It used to be like Orlando, Central Florida was all 9B. And you can see that for 10B extends all the way up into St. Lucie County along the coast here. So that really dramatically shifts how we can think about some of the plants. So no, we're good for next slide. So on the other side of this, we also want to keep in mind right plant, right place. Obviously, temperature and climate is a big aspect of this. But the other thing big thing in Florida that we have to think about is that we don't have a lot of elevation change, but we do have a lot of change in terms of below ground conditions. And so much of the state, we're not very developed enthesalts. So we think of these as like places that are really xeric or sandy. The Lake Wales Ridge runs up the middle of the state, and that's super well drained soil. And then for a lot of a good chunk of the state along the coast, we're running into these spodosols, which are kind of somewhere in the middle. They're not the most ideal for drainage. There's usually a pretty big clay layer somewhere in there that allows water to pool up. And then on the extreme end of low drainage, you've got histosols, which is like kind of like what a lot of the Everglades area is, and tends to be completely just biomass material that's just accumulated and retains water very, very well, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So next slide. So, and you can see here, this is kind of like the two sides of this in Florida. You've got the xeric upland environments that are super sandy, and then on the other end, you might have like cypress domes and other areas that are just inundated throughout a good chunk of the year. Next slide. So, and then on top of that, you've got urban environments, which tend to make things even a little bit more complicated because of the fact that they're not very well drained. They're unnatural. Like you've got, and there's limited rooting for some of these places in some instances. So just something to keep in mind. Because of that compaction, a lot of trees that might prefer your more well-drained environments, they might have problems with a lot of like our urban conditions because of that, because a lot of times there's just poor aeration and therefore waterlogging and that type of thing. No, next slide. So as we were kind of talking about, there were a lot of natives out there, what we think of natives, and we're trying to kind of press the paradigm to start thinking about species that we don't see too much. People do think of bald cypress, pond cypress, live oak, laurel oak, and then when you start getting into these places where there is less subject to freezes, you've got gumbo limbo, mahogany, Dahoon hollies all over the state. But these are really what I think of when people think of natives. They tend to think of these. And we're going to cover some that are a little bit more common too, but maybe get a bad rap and do need to be thought about a little bit more, where they're the right plant for the right place. And so I think actually that leads us to our first species, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Yvette here for that.
Hi, thanks, John. And my name's Yvette Goodiel. I'm the Sustainability and Commercial Horticulture Extension Agent in Martin County. And I'm happy to be here to share some of this information with John. So the first species to talk about is, yes, one of those species that's, commonly viewed out there in Florida, but maybe sometimes looked on in a less favorable light, but used in the right way, it can be a really great plant. So that's the slash pine, Pinus eliatii. And that's how I pronounce it, at least. And as you know, it gets to be a very tall tree and has its needles and these, the leaves are needles arranged in these fascicles, usually in groups of 2, sometimes 3. And it has these cones. And so between the cones and the needles, it can be kind of a messy tree, not one that you would necessarily want to place over top of a screened in pool or something like that. Also to be aware of is that pines are self-pruning generally. So the lower branches will start to droop and naturally self-prune. So being aware of that when siting these trees as well. Okay. And so pines, I grew up in Florida, so pines are like home to me. And you can see from this map here that they're all along the coastal United States, and a lot of the habitat that we find pines in is pine flatwoods, mesic pine flatwoods, hydric pine flatwoods, savannas. So it's just, to me, a nice aesthetic with the beautiful, colorful, texturized bark of the pines and this mix of understory species with kind of a, in a fire managed pine flatwood, it'd be a clear view through the trees. And then I put this picture in there as well, because again, they also often grow in wetter situations where they'll be more stunted in their growth. But you can see from the map before, in the hardiness zones, they grow well throughout the state. Medium low wind resistance. In my experience with them, I grew up next to pines in our yard and next door. And when the storms would come through Central Florida, they would bend a lot, and I would worry about them breaking, but we didn't have issues with them breaking in those normal Central Florida thunderstorms. But with the recent storms, I did just see with Milton that came through, Milton and Helene, there was some breakage at the extension office in St. Lucie County of pines there from those really heavy winds. But they tolerate a variety of soils and they are available. I used Natives for Your Neighborhood for my availability information, but John will also share some other references to find out about availability of these native plants. Slash pine does have some vulnerabilities, but when you start reading into them, a lot of those vulnerabilities mostly come out when they're stressed due to root injury during construction, maybe some soil compaction during construction, like John mentioned, planting them in places where they're going to be irrigated with high pH water, and that causes chlorosis, like you see in this picture here, or where they're over fertilized. So a good recommendation is to keep a wide berth around them during construction, and when keep turf grass out from underneath the drip line, and ideally well beyond the drip line, kind of have these islands of pines with understory vegetation as opposed to turf. Because like all trees, their roots extend well beyond the drip line, and we want to protect them. So slash pines also have great wildlife value. They're a nesting habitat for bald eagles, woodpeckers, and other birds. And so just a tremendous tree. The seeds are eaten by birds and small mammals, and so that is part of the messy factor, but it's nice to see wildlife, including squirrels, in our yards. Generally, we like that. To be aware that the slash pine, the variety densa, is what we think of as Dade County pine. That's a variety of slash pine, and it will have 2 needles per fascicle, denser wood, which is why it's looked upon so fondly for use in construction, and slower growth. So here are a few pictures I took in and around the area of slash pines and their use in the landscape. This is an entrance to a really kind of nice high-end country club, and they chose to retain the pines. They could have, I'm sure, planted some other things in this median along the road to screen the pines, but they seem to like the look of this kind of pine flatwood, and it looks like they underplanted with Fakahatchee grass on the right-hand side as well. So, and here's a park in Stewart where they've done a decent job of retaining the pines and giving them a large area beneath, a decently large area beneath them where they've kept out the turf grass. Now, did they do perfectly with the mulching? Maybe they could have eased off on the mulch a bit, but otherwise they're doing good. Here's a home where they've planted them in front of the house, and I like that they've given them some distance from the house to the planting island they've created with the oak and the coonties and the cabbage palms. But if you look up at the top of the picture, it looks like they are going to run into some power line issues down the road. And perhaps these pines might be a little too close to the live oak as well. Something to think about. Here's a couple of other examples of established pines in the landscape in our area. And, you know, in both these cases, those self-pruning limbs are not going to be a problem. The pine cones are not going to be a major problem. And they're not going to be doing a lot of heavy maintenance right at the foot of the trees, which I like. But, you know, even when we treat pines badly, they still, you know, shine through. So, you know, these are some pines in the mall parking lot, a little tiny island, and they're still doing quite well for now. I don't know if at some point they'll decline, but they're hanging in there. And I hope they continue to do well. And this, I think this is my last one. This is just a landscape buffer, and I like the way that it's just, you know, mixed overstory of pines, and it looks so much better than if this were not there. And I'll turn it back over to John.
So our next species is a soapberry. It's a one that you really don't see a whole lot. It's a little bit of a niche species. It's in the family Sapondaceae, which actually this is the soapberry family. It's a really wide species, or let me put it this way: it's a the family is very, very large though. There's maples fit in here, but so do even longans and lychees. So you can see here, this is what we think of as the, you know, kind of the type for what the species is, I guess, going back to Linnaeus. And I think that, you know, that he tried to pick the plants out that were representative for the families based off of their uses. And actually, I mean, this had a pretty good use because it was something where the berries could actually be used for soap if they're agitated with water and whatever else that you want to use. People still use them for washing themselves. They use them for washing clothes. And it's an interesting tree. So there's still pockets of it throughout the state. But yeah, it's something that doesn't get used a whole lot. And there's a couple reasons for that, but it's just something we want people to be aware of and to think about. And it does retain these. It is somewhat deciduous, which is something that some of these natives is going to come up. But if they're planted in the right place and surrounded by the right plants, there's no need for some of the plants we use in the landscape for everything to be a show-stopping type plant. There's appropriate places for everything. So right plant, right place. And this is just one of these more interesting ones we want people to think about. Next slide, please. And so you can see here, here's the range for what historically we had lumped into like one species of Sepindus. But now they're kind of, the splitters are at the point where like they're turning this into treating it as two kind of separate species instead of two different varieties. And you can see we're lumped in more, the species that we have in Florida is lumped closer to what you would see throughout the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico. And and this is called the wingleaf soapberry. So yeah, it's found all over. It's pretty hardy to cold temperatures, even though it tends to be kind of a more tropical type plant, what we think of it. There's very limited availability of it, but I've propagated it personally, like from seed before. And so maybe there's more potential for it. Like I said, it's kind of niche. Some people don't like the fact that it loses its leaves during the winter. It doesn't have great wind resistance, but it's not a really big tree anyway. And then as noted, another big thing to keep in mind is that the berry, and I don't know if it's just all the berry or if it's the seed, it can be poisonous. And so there is something that like maybe this isn't the greatest one for people that have kids or pets in their landscapes. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're still continuing with the way that we're breaking this down is we're trying to have the different species that fit within it or different families. And so this is another member of that family, the Sapondaceae or soapberry family. And this is called inkwood or white ironwood. And there is a black ironwood that's unrelated, but this is in contrast to that species. It shares a very similar range. And then on top of that, they think that inkwood might come from the fact that the berries of this species, people historically had used them for ink. And so, and this is an interesting one. It gets 20 to 35 feet tall, really one that we don't see much planted as a landscape species. And then it's an evergreen, and it is pinnately compound. So you can kind of see here that there are all of these little things here, like these are actually leaves with individual leaflets, and each of the leaves has 4 to 6 of these leaflets on it. It's dioecious, so not all, if you don't want the berries, potentially you can try and get a male individual of this species because it's separated between male and female. It will bloom all year round if you do have a female of the species. And the fruit matures to a dark purple berry. Next slide, please. And you can see here's some examples of what the flower and the fruit look like. And this is the mature fruit here when it gets to be dark purplish black. Next slide, please. So like a lot of these that we think of as kind of the most quote unquote keys type species, this one is found throughout much of the Caribbean basin and Central America. And I mean, you can kind of think of actually in many regards, like Florida being the most northern island of the Caribbean basin and the Keys really being buffered from the cold. And so some of these species were getting up into Miami-Dade County. Some of them go all the way up the coast. It just depends on like what their cold tolerance is like. In both coasts, it was kind of interesting. We were looking at the yesterday how their distributions were for these various species that we're talking about. Some of them tended to be more in the Gulf, and some of them tended to be more in the Atlantic. But in any case, they're all native to the state. They probably have lots of wildlife that have co-evolved with them here and can make use of them and have inherent value because of that. This one, there's not a lot out there in terms of thinking about its tolerance to wind. It's probably pretty high. Most things that like have strong wood, like in high density wood, tend to be on the higher side of wind resistance, but there's nothing formally out there. Availability, I was using Plant Ant to look at. Yvette and I were kind of using different sources because Plant Ant I tend to go to more because that's wholesale, and like for people that are trying to contract out, it's a little bit more valuable for them. I think if you've got the right will for any of the species like that we're covering, you should be able to find it. If you can find it in great quantity or whether it's affordable, that's a whole different matter. So that's really the issue for a lot of people trying to get these species. And so I think this would be one of these ones where it would be tough if you're doing a big job to get a lot of these. Yeah, and the berries as well, they've got high wildlife value. And it's a difficult one to propagate, apparently. So that might be something that leads to like the availability. Unless you know what you're doing, it might require scarification or something, some extra process with the berries or the seeds inside of the berries to like get them to propagate properly, leading to like maybe why it's not a super common one. Next slide. All right, Yvette.
All right. So yeah, so the next one is buttonwood, and I'm going to be talking about green and silver buttonwood, which are some of they're more widely known species in the landscape. So green buttonwood, it'll often have a vase-shaped form. You can see it does here in this picture, very wind resistant. Here's a photo of photo of the flower. So these small flower clusters, they're not showy. And then the seeds, which are in these little cone-like heads. And the leaves are this simple and entire. They're not lobed. Just nice glossy leaves. And the hardiness zones, this is more of a plant for further south in the state. But you can see that it has been vouchered quite far up into and through Central Florida along the coast. It does sometimes get sooty mold, usually inland was what I read about in the literature with that. And that echoes what our staff horticulturist heard from one of the kind of old timer landscapers who said that when he gets issues with sooty mold, he sprays the plants with some salt water and he feels like that helps. Oh, that was interesting. The natural habitat of buttonwood is going to be kind of on that inland fringe of the mangrove swamps. And so, thinking of that, this is going to be a plant that's tolerant of salt water, salt spray, and some shade, and a pretty durable wind resistant tree. And it is widely available. And looking up the wildlife value of this tree, it is an important epiphyte host tree in South Florida. This is a photo of an epiphyte, not a buttonwood. It's also a food and cover source for wildlife, including birds. And it's both a larval host and a nectar plant for butterflies, including those that I've listed here. And so this is another photo of it. This has got more of a vertical structure to it. And then here's a photo of it at our office. I just find this example to be pretty because you've got the contrast of the bright green leaves next to the colorful croton and the in this case, it's a multi-trunked example of this species, and that nice furrowed textured bark. It looks really pleasant. And then here are a couple of examples of it being used at a couple of seaside parks. They're actually across from one another in Stewart. On the left, as you can see, is a pretty new planting of a single trunked version. They're growing there in the parking lot islands. And then on the right, you've got a really formally hedged version of this green buttonwood. And then this is another example of, kind of large multi-trunked green buttonwoods. They make a nice screening buffer between a parking lot and the roadway. They are having some power line conflicts, but we compare this to, on the other end of that same street, these are some oaks. I believe they're laurel oaks that were planted beneath the power lines, beneath that same run of power lines. And this is how they look. And then even worse, when they lose some leaves in the cooler months. So I think compared to this, the buttonwood is going to be easier to manage, though of course we'd rather see it not planted underneath power lines. And then the silver buttonwood is known as a variety of green buttonwood, although I did read that there is some debate over whether it is a true taxonomic variety. But a lot of the care and description is very similar for the two, except that the silver buttonwood is silver because it has these kind of fine silvery hairs on the leaves. And here's an example. It's in that same seaside park with the green buttonwood. And I just love that kind of gnarled bark. And then here across the street I think this is by the Elliott Museum, trimmed up as a formal hedge. Here's another parking lot where they brought in some new silver buttonwoods. And I like the contrast of these leaves against the backdrop of the dark green oak leaves. They are having some issues with sooty mold, and I've shown that picture here. Hopefully they will recover from that or be able to manage despite it. And then this last one, I think this is a photo of the way a homeowner had used it. And I think it looks nice with all the color contrasts. If they would have pruned it probably a little wider at the base, it wouldn't be so kind of bare at the base, but they may like that look. And that's it for that one. Okay, and so I'll move on to my next one, which is the Strangler fig. And so this one, more a South Florida species. As we know about ficus, they're very large species, tall and wide. Again, big glossy green, simple leaves, evergreen. Although I think this might be partially deciduous, but and then the flower actually on figs or ficus, the flower emerges inside of the fruit where it's pollinated by a species specific wasp pollinator. And this is what the fruit looks like. They mature to a purple color when they're ripe. And it does well against high winds. I was able to find a picture of, often when we see strangler figs, we see them in the process of strangling and they don't look like an independent tree themselves. But this I found in Stewart was an independent tree. As you can see by it, there's going to be some power line issues coming up, but naturally they would grow in hammocks. And so with that, they're going to be, if they're a coastal hammock, have some moderate salt tolerance and some tolerance to salt spray, and great habitat for birds with that lovely canopy and all of those fruits. But be careful of the roots, including those secondary roots that drop down from the canopy. And then this is a little interview with our county horticulturist about some that she planted.
Hey everyone, I'm here with the Strangler fig. This is a native ficus. There are two native ficus to our region. One is Ficus aurea and one is Ficus citrifolia. And the reason why I picked the Strangler fig for this particular park was because the Parks and Rec came to me and said, hey, we want to add more shade to the sidewalks, which is always a good goal. And so I was like, ooh, what do we got going on here? And you'll see that right here is an inlet. So very salty, oftentimes extremely windy here. And so I came to the site and I looked around. I said, what likes to grow here? I never try and fight an uphill battle with my landscape palette. And so here to my right is a living shoreline buffer zone. And so I said, oh wow, look, there are all these native strangler figs and they aren't being salt pruned. They provide great shade. Everybody loves the look of a banyan, and this is very similar. And so that's what we chose to do. These trees have been in for almost 2 years now, and they're doing very well. We did hedge our bets because, we want to make sure that we give these trees the best chance of success. And so we did kind of engineer this overhead irrigation just to help them out a little bit during establishment, to rinse off that salt and hopefully create a very full canopy tree. One consideration when planting this tree is space. It is a very large tree. So you can see I planted it very far from the sidewalk. Additionally, this tree has immense wildlife value. So it has one pollinator, and so to keep that pollinator around, it has to flower and fruit very often, which birds love the berries of a strangler fig. It's very good food for them. The pollen is good for them, but that does sometimes create a little bit of a mess. And so again, you want to just think about how can you design your landscape using an awesome tree like this without creating problems for yourself later. So again, I feel that it's far enough from the sidewalk that Parks and Rec won't have to be constantly pressure washing the sidewalk or, you know, blowing off the sidewalk from the berries that this will eventually produce.
Sorry. Okay, I think that's it for the ficus.
Okay, so our next tree is a Hercules club or toothache tree. So this is a pretty interesting one. It's in the citrus family or Rutaceae. And so it's actually a native member of that family that dealt well with this environment in Florida, and was around, and consequently there are some related pests between the native citrus or our native citrus and like what we eventually came to plant here for horticultural food production. It's kind of a interesting form. They can get up to 40 feet tall, but they often will form thickets. They can spread below ground. And another thing, this is one of these deciduous ones, and it has a compound leaf, as you can see here. And on the leaves themselves, there's actually a gland that produces a chemical that can be used as an analgesic. So hence the name toothache tree. It was something that was used for numbing for people that like historically might have had pains in their mouths, or even for potentially like going in and doing old school surgery, I guess, so to speak, or operations. So the fruits, they're little follicles and clusters that doesn't produce an orange, but it would still be, I think, a small little pome, technically. So, and they're shiny red to black as they mature. So, and the other thing is interesting is the bark. It has this kind of warty nodules on it, and that's part of why it gets its other common name, Hercules club, is it does look like it would be a club as well. So next slide, please. You can see it does have thorns as well, something that a lot of the citrus family tends to have. And this is an interesting one because it kind of deviates from what we've been looking at for a lot of the species we're covering today. This is one of the ones that would be a more temperate type range, but it really does quite well in South Florida as well. So it follows the coast all the way down to Miami-Dade County in its natural range. And but however, this is not one that is super well adapted for wind. This is going to contrast quite a bit from one of the others that we're going to be covering in the same family. It's interesting that like just because things are in the same family, they can have totally different traits with regards to wind resistance. And this is one of the ones that doesn't hold up well, but fortunately it's a small tree, and it may not be something you want to use like as a statement piece in your landscape, but if you have a little bit of space and you want something interesting and you potentially want to it's still a conversation piece to take people out and show them that you chew on the leaves and they can numb your mouth a little bit. Availability, there's not a lot out there, at least what I was able to find on Plant Ant. So, I mean, like I said, for a lot of these, you could probably find them in native nurseries if you do enough digging, but you're going to have to like pay a little bit more relative. And I mean, yeah, those are going to be retail prices and that type of thing. There are some other xanthozylums that are out there. Xanthozylum spinosum is one of them, and then there's Xanthozylum fagera, which is a wild lime. We'll be covering that one too. Next slide, please. Oh, and we got another video here.
All right, so what are some outstanding wildlife features of this tree?
Well, there are a couple pretty cool ones. So the leaves are eaten by the giant swallowtail butterfly. That is the butterfly that the caterpillar is really not very attractive. It looks like bird poop, but it becomes this gorgeous butterfly. And something kind of unique about the leaves is there are what are called pellucid dots in the leaf. And when you hold it up to the light, you'll see them. Those are oil packets. And if you chew on it, it makes your mouth go numb. I must have just chewed on it. And another cool feature was that it does have thorns, and the thorns are used by birds to kill their prey with, or kind of use like a pantry, you know, like you could stick your berry here and then go do something else and then come back and get your berry later. So interesting, cool wildlife uses with the Hercules Club.
Okay, next slide. So here's just an example of some of the swallowtails species. I think Yvette will probably go in a little bit more detail with this, but I think this is the giant swallowtail. One of the potential larval hosts that for this species that you'll see is like you'll see these larvae on there potentially. They do look like bird poop. So that's their camouflage to look like something that's, you know, animals might want to try and avoid, but it's actually probably good for a lot of birds, big juicy caterpillars in a lot of cases. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's another one in the same family. This is sea torchwood. It's not in the same genus, but it's still something that's within that citrus rutaceae family. And it shares a lot of the same wildlife value as the other native citrus family members that we're going to cover. But this one's just got a little bit different of an aesthetic. It tends to hang on to its leaves better. It is an evergreen. It has these trifoliate leaves, which are kind of interesting and attractive. And then the other thing that really stands out about this one is that it will get these clusters of flowers that are typically, they peak in spring to fall, but they'll come out throughout all different points of the year. They eventually mature to a purplish black drupe, but the flowers themselves are very aromatic, and a lot of people like this plant because of the fact that like these flowers are available throughout the year. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is the same deal as a lot of them. You can see it goes really far north in terms of where it's been vouchered, at least on the Atlantic coast here. And in contrast to the Hercules Club, like this actually has the highest wind resistance. So and I don't know if that's something being adapted to the Caribbean basin, that those trees are, you know, they sometimes get different traits because of the fact that like there are more hurricanes that were hitting there. Different strategies for plant evolution, but this one will hold up in theory a lot better. It's about the same size as these other Rutaceae members that like we're talking about, so they're all kind of about the same size, small trees. But if you're a little bit more concerned with it being next to a building or being next to any infrastructure, this is probably a better strategy compared to some of the other ones out there. And this one has limited availability. It's out there. You can still find it. But in terms of like doing big jobs with it, that type of thing, it might be a tough one to do. And yeah, wildlife value. This one is one of the native plants that are out there that can host the swallowtail. And so Yvette will cover that in more detail. The other thing that's interesting about it is its name is torchwood. It's really a highly oily amount of wood, and it was something that was used historically for its flammability. So with that, I think next species, please. I think it goes to you, Yvette. Yes.
All right, yeah, so wild lime, it's one of the species that John just mentioned. And so again, in the citrus family, can get up to about 25 foot tall. You can grow this as a small, relatively small tree or as a shrub. And it's tolerant of acidic or alkaline soil, and it has a high drought tolerance. So there's a picture of it on the right, grown like the multiple trunks, and a nice small tree. And then here's a close-up of the flowers. These are not showy flowers, but they're quite nice. And then they develop these into fruits. And it's actually, the fruit is a follicle, turns this red color, and then opens up to release the seed as it dries out. So here's kind of a tour of one of the wild limes in our office demonstration garden. So you can see the thorns on it, like the others, it has thorns, and they're capturing some of, I think it's lovegrass seeds. That's what you see blowing in the wind there. And then we're going to come to a close-up. Those are the dried out fruits, and I'll have a picture of those after. And these are the compound leaves, and the rachis, that kind of stem that connects all of those leaflets, is winged. It's pinnately compound like a feather. And I already mentioned the thorns. Yeah. Just a nice compact shrub is the way we've grown it here so far. And there's a close-up of the dehisced follicles that have mostly all released their seeds. I think you can see one black seed there that hasn't yet come out. And then these kind of hooked spines that it has. And so, you might be thinking, oh, a plant with spines, let me steer away. But, think of, like, we do use bougainvillea. This is a picture I took of a very well-loved, well-tended bougainvillea in someone's yard in Stewart. And here it's nice. The color is a nice backdrop to the deep green behind it. But you could also think of an instance where you might want a green in front of a colorful background of crotons or tea plants or or you might just want a nice green mixed species barrier. So this can be was referred to in one of the pieces I read as a spiny barrier. So there you go. And wild lime naturally occurs in coastal strand habitats, which is kind of that habitat that you have between the herbaceous dominated dune and the maritime forest. It's kind of a shrubby habitat. So again, it's going to be relatively tolerant of things like salt spray and wind and sunlight, so ours is growing in pretty much full sun. Mostly it occurs down through South Florida. I think I have the range map as far as hardiness zones, but it has been vouchered up through Central Florida. And it is the larval host for the giant swallowtail and Chaucis swallowtail in South Florida. And so it is unique in that way. So Chaucis swallowtail is this large butterfly you see pictured here, and it's endemic to Florida, meaning it's only found in Florida and nowhere else. And this and the other species, the sea torchwood that John mentioned, are the host plants for it, the larval host plants. So you can see this middle picture is where the eggs of the swallowtail have been laid on the wild lime. And then here's a larvae of the Chaucis swallowtail there. So, not only is it a unique plant to bring diversity to the landscape, but it's also very important for one of our endemic Florida butterflies, which is federally listed. The Chaucis swallowtail butterfly is the only federally listed butterfly in Florida. And there's a picture of a wild lime John took with, I believe, a different species of swallowtail larvae on it. Okay, and then here is wild cinnamon. This is a photo that John took outside of their extension office, and you can see what a beautiful planting this is. This use of the wild cinnamon here is several trees in a row to give some shade and a nice look to the front of the building. And they usually grow taller than wide, but they can get up to 29 feet at the most, but usually more around 15 to 20 foot. And they are available through Central and South Florida. This is a photo of the bark and the flowers. So the flowers are in these kind of semi-showy clusters, and they start out with kind of green and purple buds, and then those open up into these red flowers with the yellow inside, the yellow anthers and pollen. And then the leaves of the wild cinnamon. So it's an evergreen with glossy, simple leaves with these red berries that ripen in winter. So that's another nice feature of it. And the natural habitat it would occur in would be in the subcanopy of coastal hammocks. So there again, if it's in the subcanopy, then that means it's going to be tolerant of some shade and tolerant of some salt spray and saltwater inundation. But being in a hammock where it's used to having this kind of a decent amount of organic matter in the soil, it has a moderate drought tolerance. It's used to a little bit more of a moist environment. And wild cinnamon is a nectar plant for butterflies, including Schaus's swallowtail. So it's not a larval plant, it's a nectar plant for the Schaus's swallowtail. The leaves have a spicy fragrance when they're crushed. The inner bark is used was used in the 1700s as a substitute for cinnamon. And the outer bark is toxic, so that's important to be aware of. And this species is endangered in Florida. And there again, it's the Schaus's swallowtail. All right, and this is the last of the species that I'll be covering. So this is Lignum vitae, and this is a photo that John provided of, I believe it's growing there at the extension office. So this is a very slow growing plant, can get up to 30 foot tall, but usually much smaller, multi-trunked, drooping branches. The canopy can be kind of wide or kind of this vase-like you see here. And the leaves are, again, that have that pinnate formation. They're evenly pinnate, and they're evergreen. The flowers all come out all year, though, especially in the summer. They're bluish purple or white, born in clusters, and the fruits then develop. And those are heart-shaped yellow-orange capsules, and they open to reveal these kind of red and black seeds. And apparently they'll appear alongside the flowers, so you get this really colorful display. And it is important to know there is another species of the same genus that is not native and also gets purple or white flowers. So this is another species that would naturally occur in hammocks. So it's going to have some wind resistance. It's going to be able to tolerate some shade. It is a larval host plant for a type of sulfur butterfly. It offers food and cover for birds, and it's a pollinator plant. I did wonder, oh yeah, I'll talk about that now. Yeah. So as far as soils, tolerant of a range of soils, being a hammock species, again, it does best with soils that have some organic content. It's pretty drought tolerant, moderately tolerant of salt spray. And I looked up why it was named, the common names include tree of life and holywood, and I wondered why that was. And at first I thought it was because it has had a lot of uses because the wood is very dense and heavy. And so the wood was used in making bowling balls and used on ships as like propeller shafts and bearings because the wood is not only very strong, but also apparently self-lubricating and resistant to sea worms. So it was a very, very useful wood. And then also, when the Spanish came here and they were under the understanding that this would protect them or cure diseases, including syphilis. And so there began exportation of this tree to it was cut down, harvested, and taken to Europe. And there was a later account. I was reading about this in a book, an ethnobotany by Daniel Austin, about how later when the English surveyed the coast of Florida, they found all these trees had been cut. And now where it remains, it's threatened as other species are by habitat degradation. And I believe there's a pest that's impacting it as well. So again, a great one to cultivate and bring back into our state in greater numbers. Okay, back to John.
All right, folks, I know that we're like at the end of the hour here. If you need to head out, no problem. If you're here for CEUs, we'll go ahead and process everything, as is. But if you can't stick around, I'm going to cover 2 more species, and then we can have a little bit of Q&A for anybody that is able to also hang out for a little bit into the next hour. And we'll try and be wrapped up and out of here by 1:15 at any rate. So the last 2 are members of the Fabaceae family. So this is a really widespread family as well. Tons and tons of species that are representative of this throughout the tropics, even not in the tropics, in the temperate areas too. I mean, we think of here, probably the most common member of this in Florida that we think of is probably the Royal Poinciana. But this is kind of the closest thing that we have to this that's like a native, and it has a very similar form in many ways, this wild or false tamarind. And it gets that name because it does look like a tamarind tree, which is another member of the Fabaceae. However, the pods don't produce anything that's edible like the true tamarind. But yeah, it has a very similar aesthetic, has very small leaves and leaflets. So you could, well, I guess the leaves are large, but the leaflets are quite small, which is kind of a nice aesthetic. And so the leaves are alternate. It's one of these ones out there that if you're on the plant ID, it's bipinnately compound. So like there's a rachis, and then like on each rachis, like there's another set of rachi that go out from them. And like that's where the leaflets are at. So like you've got 2 sets of these rachises. It's not just something that's regularly compound, it's bipinnately. So it's there's not a lot of things out there that will do that. So that really helps narrow things down if you're trying to do plant identification. And then you can see there's 10 to 20 pairs of secondary leaflets along one of these as well. So you see that in this image, there's a flower that eventually comes out from spring to summer. It's white and globular. And you can see here it comes out from the leaf axils. Eventually it turns into a dry fruit. I think I've got another image of that will be popping up here eventually, but doesn't look all that much like what a tamarind pod. They've got their own distinct pods. So But yeah, turns into a large tree. A lot of the plants that we were covering here earlier, they tended to be on the small side. This is one of the ones that if you need to put in a big spot and you want to use something other than mahogany and live oak, which tend to be our two biggest species that we use for natives in this area, this is a good alternative to be thinking about. However, it is a little on the cold hardy side. Next slide, please. So here's what it looks like when it's mature or becoming fully mature. Spreads out quite a bit, and I mean that's pretty typical for a lot of the species that are in this pea or bean family. Next slide, please. So here's the native range. It's again follows very closely like a Caribbean species, Central American. You can see here though it is 10B to 11, so should be conscious of that. Go back and refer to the USDA hardiness zones. This is one you probably don't want to push. Some of these other species you could potentially push further north and you might get some success. This one is a little bit more on the sensitive side. It also prefers dry sites, and it does not have like a super high salt tolerance. So keep that in mind as well. It's got pretty good wind resistance. It's a pretty strong tree relative to some of the ones that are out there. It's got a really decurrent form though, which probably is what contributes to it to not being the highest wind resistance level. And it is fairly well compared to some of the natives out there. This one is pretty widely available. And I think that it is due to the fact that it does quite well in urban environments. I mean, it does, how do I put it? It's a pretty hardy plant overall. It can deal with a lot of the tough urban conditions. I guess the big thing to think about with this one is just making sure that there's enough space for it. And I mean, that also includes below ground space. It does like things on the drier side. You're trying to put it into a really compacted site. I mean, that's usually a tough call for a lot of species. This one is probably not super well adapted for that. If you're dealing with somewhere that deals with high potential flooding or water inundation type issues. But yeah, here's the pod. That's what that looks like. Next slide, please. Oh, and the last tree that we're going to cover is Jamaican dogwood. It's Piscidia piscula. It's actually that genus name is Piscidia means it means killer of fish in Latin, which is an interesting note about this one, that it was used as a means of potentially poisoning fish, or at least making them enter kind of a stupor and making them easier to be caught by like the folks that originally used it, the Native Americans. So yeah, it also has a couple names that are related to that besides Jamaican dogwood. It's Florida fish poison tree and also fish fuddle. So yeah, again, another one of these members of the pea or bean family. It gets up to 45 feet tall, but this is one that you should keep in mind. The form on this one, it's very spreading. It can have a kind of an irregular shape to the crown, and probably will require, if you wanted to have a regular shape to it, might require a little bit of specialized pruning to get it to that point, structural pruning. This one also doesn't retain its leaves all throughout the year. Instead of like cold seasonality that we think of, this one, the leaves, it will lose according to the dry time of year. So if you go out, we've got some of them in the Mouse Botanical Garden where our extension office is at. It's pretty bare right now because we're in the middle of the dry season, and then it really won't start getting those leaves back until about March or so. It does have an interesting flower, hence the name dogwood. It's not related at all to what we think of traditional dogwoods, but you can see how somebody might think it resembles those trees. And then eventually the fruit will mature into a papery bean-like pod that are 8 to 10 centimeters long, and those will mature into the summer. So next slide, please. So here's Here's what the flower will look like. They actually have kind of a range of colors that are out there. It could be lavender to pink to even a little bit red, but they're all kind of a little bit light. They tend to tinge. They're mostly white, but then they tinge out to these other colors. Next slide, please. And so, and then here's what the pods look like. And actually, you can see here, this is how they look a lot of the time, is that, you know, it was a hammock type species. It has a little bit of partial shade tolerance. And so you can have in natural areas, this is what they tend to look like, and why, if you want them to be a more full looking tree, it might require a little bit of shaping in the landscape and a maintained area. But yeah, and then here's the paper type pods that they mature to on the right hand side. Next slide, please. So again, pretty important species for certain native insects, particularly it's a larval host for a couple of butterflies that are out there. The hammock skipper and the cassius blue. So, and you can see here, yeah, they have had it vouchered all the way up into Hillsborough and Pinellas County. But yeah, again, this is one of these more Caribbean type species that and is really common in parts of Central America and Mexico as well, I believe. So, and then yeah, you can see it's hardy. This one you might be able to push a little bit further north as well because of the 9B. Some of these areas being 9B, like in Hillsborough. However, keep in mind these might be a little bit more oriented towards the coast where there's a little bit more cold protection. So caveat emptor, you've been warned, not everything is going to work. It's biology, things aren't perfect. But if, you know, it's on you if you want to try and push it and up in this 9B range. Wind resistance, it's medium low, and availability, it's out there. It's kind of like a lot of these. It's like if you want to track it down, it's there, but if you want it for large jobs, it's probably going to be somewhat expensive. So I think we're wrapped up in terms of the species. There's tons of resources out there. I really want to draw attention to Dr. Ryan Klein. He's got Florida Trees recommendation tool for urban and suburban sites. A lot of these trees are going to be on there. And so, I mean, originally this was started with Dr. Ed Gilman, and like it's been updated to be retained on the internet and in its current form. So it's a pretty good tool that more people should be aware of. Any tree, anytime in Florida we think of trees, we should be thinking somewhat of wind tolerance. And you know, I think that like even the intolerant species, like they've got their place, like maybe down next to a building, but there's something we should think about if you have the space for them. But you should be thinking about their wind tolerance. We've got the old UF publications, which are still up. But now they've taken it to the next level a little bit, like with just trying to model out species that didn't make it onto those original lists. So that came out on a FEMA document recently. It came up last webinar with Ryan Klein. So if you want to check out the Salisbury and Kozer document, it's got even more species on there and is a pretty cool tool if you're interested in looking at species for these traits. I found like for some of these, like for looking at sources, plant ant is going to be a big one. These different plant societies for native plants like have various degrees of resources. We turn quite a bit to FNPS, Florida Native Plant Society, for photos and information. And then also there's a website from one of the wholesalers that's out there, Native Trees, through Tree World Wholesale. So they had great online resources for a lot of the trees that they grow down in Homestead. And they grow more than just natives, but I was really impressed that they were quite forward looking in terms of the resources that were there. And then also, if you're looking for book forms, Tropical Trees of Florida and the Virgin Islands by Kent Kirk, and then also South Florida and the Keys Trees. There's a lot of palms in this one. This is one of the Kozer books that was put out through an ISA and UF grant. It might be tough to track down. I think it's been out of print for a while, but pretty good resource. It's out there. And so with that, I think we can probably, will be to be continued. There's a lot of other plants that we're going to cover next time. Probably going to be the same deal. We were probably a little bit overly ambitious in terms of like what we wanted to provide for you, but we're hoping to convert this as well into like kind of an online resource, and maybe we'll even expand on what we covered today and January to be more encompassing of like what's out there. So, with that said, Yvette and I think we can take a couple questions before we got to bounce here. Yvette might have to bounce very soon, but we can hang out here for anybody that might have questions for the next 5-10 minutes or so. Okay, F&PS plants as searchable plant database to help match plant lists to match sites. Okay, so there's more tools out there. So check out F&PS. Like if you look at their plant profiles, they do a great job in terms of talking about environmental conditions and matching those potentially to the plants that you have. So I really, I mean, we were largely indebted to F&PS and like their resources for making this PowerPoint. And we really like working with them too. So I think we're going to be having in January, they're going to be doing like a native plant expo in Palm Beach County at the community college or state college. And I think we'll be presenting there for Palm Beach County Extension. What's compatible with sidewalks and swales? Well, yeah, February 23rd, 22nd, 23rd, pardon me. Like that's when that will be. And so this is kind of a glimpse at like what is going to be in the future if you're going to be able to attend that as well. I guess the big thing to think about here swales and sidewalks, I guess tight spaces is, I think that like we get a little overly ambitious when things get planned out, and people tend to put larger species in these areas that there's plenty of smaller species that are suited for. We covered some of them here that would probably be appropriate and probably should have more use. So, I think in particular that wild cinnamon might work there in some instances. And then I know that probably not great would be some of those Rutaceae species, like the citrus species, because they're so thorny. It might be kind of a problem for pedestrians, but I don't know. Are there any? I think we're going to be covering a lot more of those too, smaller species next time. So inkwood tends to be a little bit on the bigger side. I mean, I like it, but it matures into a larger tree potentially. I mean, you're going to run into the same issues that what happens with like what people planting in like live oaks and stuff, and those, it just keep in mind the size of the swale is really what it comes down to. Some swales, not all swales are made the same. Crabwood would be a good one. Yeah, we'll talk about crabwood in January. Soldierwood's not a big one. Yep, stoppers. So those would all work. But you guys are getting ahead of us. We're going to be talking about these next time. So I'm kind of holding back on some of my cards here. But yeah, the buttonwood, definitely. You got any ideas, Yvette, for smaller trees? I guess things that work for swales.
I mean, I know we've got a pond apple in our swale, and it's doing quite well, though the county agreed to preserve it, even though it's in an area that they maintain, and I love seeing it. And I like some of the other suggestions. I don't have the long time experience with having some of those next to sidewalks to know, but just the stoppers, especially the Simpson stopper and the wild cinnamon that we have in our yard. I don't they've been there a while. They're decent size and I don't see any problems with surface roots that would be a problem for a sidewalk.
Yeah. No, I think that some of those are not, people just don't turn to them enough. And some of those stoppers are a little bit more widely available, or at least becoming more common, I believe. But the pond apple too is, I think that might have some availability because it's used for like a reclamation or mitigation species. And I think it's pretty easy to propagate, but yeah, it would kind of, it can get a little unruly. And I think it just depends where you're at, right? Like for wet, but yeah, what's better than that on a wet site that nobody is going to be really going into or anything like that anyway. So somebody's mentioning Guyana plum, Tripetes. Yeah, that's another 20 to 30 foot tall tree. So it's a native. So I mean, there's a lot out there. So this is a theme. We're trying to like promote these species because I mean, natives are good. And then there's also lots of underutilized things that are out there as well that don't get enough press. And a lot of the natives fit within those categories. In the next year, we've got two great, I guess the schedule is out now. I'm going to try and include that with like emailing folks. We got to bounce here in the next minute or so. So I'll follow up with the reporting and put it on YouTube for everyone that attended here. And there will be a part 2 for anyone that's able to make it next month. We'll go ahead and forward that stuff information, and then we'll cover a lot of the other species that you might be curious about here, but we're not going to, by and large, we're not going to hit everything, but we will try and hit more and more of that down the road. And then actually in December next year, getting really ahead of ourselves here, Yvette and Kara will be doing a talk on natives, small native shrubs to trees for tight spaces. And this goes to the canopy issue in South Florida. A lot of people are really wary of large trees. Well, you can make up for that somewhat by planting more smaller trees that might not have the same amount of risk associated with them. And we really should be having that conversation more of fitting in little trees where we can put them in the landscape. And so having many of them in your arsenal, so to speak, or your palette is going to be key for managing or trying to promote canopy wherever we can fit it in South Florida. So anything else, Yvette? So yeah, Yvette and I need to run. It was wonderful hanging out with you here in December. Happy holidays. Hope you all have a nice new year. Why wanting only grade 1? Are you talking about FDAX? Catherine, if you've got any questions, please just go ahead and just shoot us emails and we'll get back to you. So, but with that, we gotta head out. You take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.